Good morning. In our last class, we went through the Act 1 in detail. Today, we are going through the Act 2 and 3. Let us start with the Act 2. The narrator of Act 2 is Edward Rochester, the hero of Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre. He is never named in Rice's novel, but the details he gives of his life make it clear to the reader that he is a younger version of Bronte's character. In Act 2, Edward Rochester is the narrator. Actually, Jane Rice doesn't give the name for this character. She introduces this character as Antoinette's husband. But we can assume that Antoinette's husband is the hero of Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre. The narration of Part 2 begins several months after Antoinette voiced her fears of leaving her sanctuary of the convent for the outside world. In that time, Mr. Mason has died and his son Richard has arranged the marriage of Antoinette to Rochester. When the Act 2 begins, Antoinette fears about her future life. When she leaves the convent, she has a lot of anxieties in her life. At that time, Mr. Mason dies and his son Richard Mason takes the decision relating Antoinette's marriage. Richard Mason fixes Antoinette's marriage with Rochester. I told you Jane Rice doesn't give a name for her husband, but it is understood to be Jane Eyre's Mr. Rochester, an English gentleman. The husband is deeply disoriented, even disturbed by the Jamaican landscape and culture. After a wedding ceremony in Spanish Town, he and Antoinette honeymoon on one of the Windward Islands near Jamaica at an estate that once belonged to Antoinette's mother. Antoinette and her husband go to Windward Island to celebrate their honeymoon. This estate is belonging to Antoinette's mother. He begins to have misgivings about the marriage as they approach a town ominously called Massacre. He knows little of his new wife, having agreed to marry her days before when Mr. Mason's son, Richard Mason, offered him £30,000 if he proposed. Desperate for money, he agreed to the marriage. Actually, Rochester agrees to marry Antoinette because of the money which offered by Mr. Mason's son Richard Mason. When the couple arrives at Grandboy's, Antoinette's inherited estate, the man feels increasingly uncomfortable around the servants and his strange young wife. He feels menaced by the strange landscape, language and customs of the Caribbean. He distrusts the servants, particularly Christophine and the young and defiant Emily. He has married Antoinette for her money and sees her as a beautiful but unsettling stranger. Antoinette's husband is disturbed after the marriage. He doesn't feel comfortable around the servants and his strange young wife. He is disturbed by the strange landscape, language, and customs of the Caribbean. He can't adjust it. He has also the doubts about Antoinette's nurse Christophine. I already told you he marries Antoinette for her money. At the same time, he admires Antoinette's beauty. Hostility grows between the man and Christophine, Antoinette's surrogate mother, and a servant who wields great power in the house. We already identified Christophine is very powerful character, but Antoinette's husband doesn't like Christophine. The two spend afternoons swimming and nights making passionate love. The man soon receives a menacing letter from Daniel Cosway, one of old Cosway's illegitimate children. Antoinette and her husband spent 2 afternoons swimming and nights making passionate love. After that, her husband gets a letter from Daniel Cosway. Old Cosway is Antoinette's peeress and possibly Daniel Cosway's father. He is dead before the start of the novel, but his licentious brutality and potential madness affect the lives of his family members for years to come. He leaves his family deep in debt when he dies. Daniel Cosway Antoinetteൻ്റെയും പിയറിയുടെയും ഫാദർ ആയിട്ടുള്ള ഓൾഡ് കോസ്വേയുടെ ഇല്ലെജിറ്റിമേറ്റ് ആയിട്ടുള്ള സണ്ണാണ്. സോ വി ക്യാൻ സീ ദാറ്റ് Daniel Cosway gives a letter to Antoinette's husband. The letter warns the husband that madness runs in the Antoinette's family on both sides, relating rumors that both Antoinette's mother and father died raving. Daniel Cosway tells Rochester of Annette Cosway's insanity and promiscuity and suggests that Antoinette was engaged in an illicit sexual relationship with her black cousin Sandy Cosway. Through this letter, Daniel Cosway warns Antoinette's husband. Daniel writes about the madness runs in the Antoinette's family, in mother's side and also the father's side. Daniel Cosway also speaks about her mother Annette Cosway's insanity. He also reveals Antoinette has an illicit sexual relationship with her black cousin Sandy Cosway. Daniel Cosway insists that Antoinette's family, especially Richard, deceived the husband when making the marriage arrangements. The husband does not mention this letter to Antoinette, but he becomes distant and cold. After reading this letter, the man begins to detect signs of Antoinette's insanity. Daniel Cosway also blames Richard Mason. I think all of you remembered well Richard Mason, Antoinette's stepfather's son. Richard Mason arranges this marriage. So Daniel also blames Richard Mason. He tells that Richard Mason deceives Antoinette's husband. But Antoinette's husband doesn't reveal this letter to Antoinette. But we can see he starts to keep a distance from Antoinette. He starts to detect signs of Antoinette's insanity. He questions her racial purity. Creole of pure English descent she may be, but her eyes are not English or European either. Antoinette's husband also blames her by her racial purity. Her husband speaks about her eyes. Her eyes are not English or European either. The narration switches to Antoinette's point of view. Antoinette, sensing that her husband hates her, she has fallen deeply in love with Rochester and is hurt by his coldness. After that, the narration switches to Antoinette's point of view. Then Antoinette starts to tell the story. Antoinette understands that her husband hates her. It makes her sad because she loves her husband deeply. She goes to Christophine's house to beg her to use Obi to make the husband love her again. She has fallen deeply in love with Rochester and is hurt by his coldness. She requests the help of Christophine. I think if you remember well, she is the Obi practitioner. She knows the black magic. That's why Antoinette requests Christophine to make the husband love her again. Christophine grudgingly agrees. Antoinette eventually wears her down, though, and Christophine supplies her with a bottled liquid. At first, Christophine is not at all ready to do the black magic against her husband, but finally she makes a bottled liquid for Antoinette. The narration shifts back to the husband's point of view. He goes to see Daniel Cosway, who attempts to blackmail the husband into giving him £500. Then we can see that again the narration shifts back to the husband's point of view. Then the husband goes to see Daniel Cosway. That night, the husband and Antoinette argue and he demands to know the truth about her past. She tells him of Colibri burning Pierre's death and her mother's descent into madness. We can see the conflict between Antoinette and her husband. Then Antoinette speaks about how the Colibri burned her brother Pierre's death and how her mother Annette becomes mad. It is revealed that her mother was sexually abused at her convalescent home. The husband begins to call her Bertha, which disturbs her. The two go to bed and Antoinette hands him a glass of wine, after which point the husband loses all memory of the rest of the night. Then she is also forced to speak about her mother, how her mother was sexually abused. Then her husband starts to call her as Bertha. I think if you remembered well, Bertha Mason in Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre. She doesn't like to call her as Bertha. After that, both of them go to bed. Antoinette gives him a glass of wine. After that, her husband loses all memory of the rest of the night. Antoinette drugs his wine with the love potion Christophine made. The drug works. Rochester makes love to Antoinette. When he awakes, he is angered by what his wife has done. Antoinette gives his wine with the love potion Christophine made. The black magic works well. As the result, Rochester makes love to Antoinette. When Rochester understands all these things, he is angered to his wife. The next morning, he realizes that Antoinette has drugged him and runs into the woods. He returns and sleeps with the servant girl Amelie, who helps him recover. Sitting in the next room, Antoinette hears everything. She tells her husband that he has destroyed the one place where she felt free and happy. Antoinette's husband takes the revenge to Antoinette by sleeps with the servant Amelie. That's why Antoinette tells her husband he has destroyed the one place where she felt free and happy. Christophine leaves Grandbois because of her dislike of the husband, which devastates Antoinette. Shortly after Christophine's departure, the husband gets lost in the woods and is sure he sees a zombie or the walking dead near an abandoned house. He is finally found by Baptiste, the butler, who refuses to answer his questions about the house. We can see that the problems start between Antoinette and her husband. So, Christophine leaves Grandbois. After that, Antoinette's husband gets lost in the woods. He sees a walking dead near an abandoned house. Finally, her husband is found by Baptiste, the butler. Baptiste, he is a butler at Grandbois. He quietly distrusts the husband and is sympathetic with Antoinette. That's why he doesn't answer the husband's questions about the house. The next morning, Antoinette leaves for Christophine's. When the husband threatens to go to the police and report her practice of hobby, Christophine, though outraged, has no choice but to relent. She leaves without saying goodbye to Antoinette. Antoinette then bites her husband's arm, drawing blood. The husband decides that they must leave Jamaica. Antoinette's husband threatens her about the black magic of Christophine. He tells her he should inform the police about this practice of hobby. That's why Christophine is forced to leave Antoinette. Without saying goodbye to Antoinette, she leaves Antoinette. Antoinette becomes more violent, bites her husband's arm. Then the husband decides to leave Jamaica. When he looks at her, he sees only her blank, lovely eyes. He decides that he will never touch her again and that he will lock her away from the caresses of others. As part 2 comes to a close, Antoinette and Rochester leave the honeymoon house and Rochester determines to sell the property. At the end of Act 2, we can see that Rochester decides to leave Jamaica. He decides that he will never touch Antoinette again. He also decides to sell the property. When she returns, she seems to be totally mad. Drunk and raving, she pleads with the man to stop calling her Bertha, a name he has given her without an explanation. So we can see that Antoinette loses her control. She always repeats to her husband to stop calling her as Bertha. Antoinette is numb and silent on the day of their departure. The husband is overtaken with remorse, but the hatred between himself and Antoinette soon outweighs it. So at the end of Act 2, the husband and wife are mentally and physically detached. Then we are going through the Act 3. Grace Poole, another character from Bronte's Jane Eyre, begins the narration of Part 3. In Bronte's novel, Grace is the woman hired to care for Bertha or Antoinette when she is locked in the attic of Thornfield Hall, Rochester's home in England. In Act 3, Grace Poole is the narrator. Jean Rice reconstructed the character Grace Poole from Bronte's Jane Eyre. We can see Grace Poole in Jane Eyre. She is the woman hired to care for Bertha in Jane Eyre. So in this novel, Jean Rice also brings Grace Poole to take care of Antoinette when she is locked in Rochester's home in England. പാർട്ട് 3 ആരംഭിക്കുന്നത് ഗ്രേസ് പൂളിൻ്റെ നരേഷനിലൂടെയാണ്. ബ്രോണ്ടേരെ ജെയിൻ ഐറിലെ ബെർത്ത മെയ്സനെ ടോൺഫീൽഡ് ഹാളിലെ പൂട്ടിയിട്ടപ്പോൾ ഗ്രേസ് പൂളാണ് അവരെ നോക്കിയത്. അതുകൊണ്ട് തന്നെയാണ് ആ ക്യാരക്ടറിനെയാണ് വീണ്ടും ജീൻ റൈസ് റോച്ചസ്റ്റർ ഇംഗ്ലണ്ടിലുള്ള തൻ്റെ വീട്ടിൽ ആൻറ്റോയിനെറ്റിനെ പൂട്ടിയിട്ടപ്പോൾ നോക്കാനായിട്ട് കൊണ്ടുവന്നിരിക്കുന്നത്. So here once again I repeat that Jean Rice reconstructed the character Grace Poole in Jane Eyre. Here Grace Poole has the responsibility to take care of Antoinette, who is locked in the attic of Rochester's home in England. In Rice's novel, Grace tells of how Rochester's father and brother have died and how Edward has become very wealthy. He has instructed his housekeeper to hire Grace at extremely high wages to look out for the mad woman Antoinette. In this novel, White Sirga Suzy, Jean Rice tells about how Rochester's father and brother have died, how Edward Rochester becomes rich. Here we can see that Rochester gives extremely high wages to Grace to look after his mad wife Antoinette. Grace calls her that girl who lives in her own darkness. She describes Antoinette as still fierce and finds that she needs to be watched carefully. Grace calls Antoinette as the girl who lives in her own darkness and also describes her as still fierce. At the same time, Grace takes care of Antoinette well. The narration switches to Antoinette's consciousness. A hidden captive, Antoinette has no sense of time or place. She does not even believe she is in England when Grace tells her so. Again, we can see that the narration shifts to Antoinette's consciousness. Actually, Antoinette doesn't have the memory. She doesn't have the power to recognize the time or place. Even she can't believe that now she is in England. Violent and frenzied, Antoinette draws a knife on her stepbrother Richard Mason when he visits her. Later, she has no memory of the incident. Antoinette also tries to kill her stepbrother Richard Mason, but she doesn't have the memory relating this incident. Antoinette has a recurring dream about taking Grace's keys and exploring the house's downstairs quarters. In this dream, she lights candles and sets the house ablaze. One night, she wakes from this dream and feels she must act on it. The novel ends with Antoinette holding a candle and walking down from her upstairs prison. Antoinette has the tendency to dream. In her dream, she is taking Grace's keys and she lights candles and also sets the house ablaze. Then she starts to feel she must act on it. When the novel Sirgasosi ends, we can see that Antoinette holding a candle and she is walking down from her upstairs prison. She reveals what happened to her after she and Rochester left the honeymoon house. Rochester kept her in a house in the countryside and hardly visited her. She was often visited by her cousin Sandy and they fall in love. Rochester, when he came to know of this, took her to England. She also speaks about the incidents after their honeymoon. We already understand Rochester leaves her in a house in the countryside. She doesn't visit her. At that period, her cousin Sandy starts to visit her and both of them fall in love. And Rochester comes to know that he takes the decision to take her to England. It is not clear how Antoinette has been confined in the attic. She is not able to distinguish between reality and nightmares. She envisions herself burning down the Thornfield Hall. She imagines jumping down the roof to the cold stones down and ending her life. Actually, we don't have the idea about how Antoinette has been locked in the attic. എന്തിനാണ് അന്റോയിനെറ്റിനെ മച്ചിന്മേലുള്ളൊരു മുറിയിൽ പൂട്ടിയിട്ടതെന്ന് അറിയില്ല. എനിവേ, she lives between reality and nightmares. Sometimes she feels that she is living in reality, but she lives with the nightmares. Her dreams get mixed up with the fire that destroyed Calibri, the burning parrot, her old friend Tia. She grabs a candle in preparation to torch Thornfield Hall, just as Bertha Mason does in Jane Eyre. Anyway, we can identify that her dreams always mix up with the fire that destroyed Calibri, the burning parrot Coco. She also thinks about her old friend Tia. Finally, she is walking with the candle like that the character Bertha Mason does in Jane Eyre. തോൺഫീൽഡ് ഹാൾ കത്തി അമരുന്നത് പലപ്പോഴും അന്റോയിനറ്റ് തൻ്റെ ഭാവനയിൽ കണ്ടിരുന്നു. അന്റോയിനറ്റിനെ തടവിലിട്ടിരുന്ന കെട്ടിടത്തിൻ്റെ മുകളിൽ നിന്ന് താഴെയുള്ള തണുത്ത് മരവിച്ച കല്ലുകളിലേക്ക് ചാടി സ്വയം ജീവൻ ഒടുക്കുന്നതായിട്ടും അന്റോയിനറ്റ് സ്വപ്നത്തിൽ കാണാറുണ്ടായിരുന്നു. അതുപോലെ തന്നെ തൻ്റെ കോളിബ്രി എസ്റ്റേറ്റും കൊക്കോ തത്തയെക്കുറിച്ചും ടിയയെക്കുറിച്ചൊക്കെ സ്വപ്നങ്ങളിൽ അന്റോയിനറ്റ് കാണുമായിരുന്നു. അവസാനം ജെയിൻ എയർ എന്ന നോവലിലെ ബെർത്ത മെയ്സൺ ചെയ്തിരുന്ന പോലെ തന്നെ തോൺഫീൽഡ് ഹാളിൽ വിളക്ക് വയ്ക്കുന്നതിന് ഒരുക്കമായിട്ട് ഒരു മെഴുകുതിരി അന്റോയിനറ്റ് എപ്പോഴും കയ്യിൽ പിടിച്ചിരുന്നു. അങ്ങനെയാണ് ഈ നോവൽ അവസാനിക്കുന്നത്. We went through the 3 acts of this novel, White Sargassoti, in detail. We will discuss the symbols and the themes of this novel White Sargasso Sea in our next class. Thank you.